Step out of the vehicle. Now. Officer, I'm confused. What's the problem? This Mercedes was reported stolen 2 hours ago. Step away from the car. That's impossible. This is my car. I have the registration right here. Sure it is. People like you always have a story. People like me. Officer, I'm showing you the documentation, don't get smart with me. You think someone like you can afford a car like this? I am a federal judge, and you need to, turn around. Hands on the vehicle. Now. The parking lot of the Whole Foods Market on Peachtree Road gleamed under the late afternoon sun of June 22, 2023, in Buckhead, Atlanta's wealthiest neighborhood. Judge Diane Matthews, a 47-year-old black woman with rich, dark brown skin, stood frozen beside her silver Mercedes-Benz E-Class, her judicial robes still hanging in the back seat from court that morning. She wore an ivory silk blouse and charcoal slacks, her natural hair styled in elegant locks that fell past her shoulders. She'd stopped to grab groceries for a dinner party she was hosting that evening, exhausted after presiding over a complex securities fraud trial. All she wanted was to get home, change clothes, and prepare for her guests. What happened in the next 37 minutes would cost Officer Brandon Mitchell his career, his freedom, and the city of Atlanta over $1.8 million in taxpayer money. It would expose a pattern of racial profiling so systematic that the Department of Justice would launch a federal civil rights investigation, uncovering 52 complaints of bias that had been dismissed without proper review. And it would transform Judge Matthews from a reserved jurist known for her calm judicial temperament into a national voice for police accountability, her case becoming mandatory training material in police academies and law schools from coast to coast, studied by thousands of officers who would learn exactly what happens when badges are used as weapons of discrimination. Judge Diane Elizabeth Matthews had earned every credential the American legal system could bestow. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Spelman College, then attended Yale Law School, where she served as an editor of the Yale Law Journal. After clerking for a U.S. Court of Appeals judge, she'd spent 12 years as an assistant U.S. attorney, prosecuting organized crime, public corruption, and civil rights violations. Her exceptional work earned her the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service in 2015. When President Obama nominated her to the federal bench in 2016, her confirmation was unanimous. In her 7 years on the bench, Judge Matthews had presided over 487 cases, written 73 published opinions cited by other federal courts, and earned respect from colleagues and lawyers alike for her meticulous preparation and fairness. She lived in Virginia Highland with her husband Marcus, a cardiothoracic surgeon at Emory University Hospital, and their 2 children. She drove a 2022 Mercedes E-Class, purchased new and fully paid off, registered in her name, with no complications whatsoever. On that Thursday afternoon, she'd finished court at 4:15 after a jury convicted a hedge fund manager of securities fraud. She'd left the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, hung her judicial robes carefully in the back seat of her Mercedes, and driven to Whole Foods. She needed groceries for a dinner party she was hosting that evening for 8 friends. She had exactly 3 hours to shop, drive home, and prepare everything. But what nobody in that Buckhead parking lot knew yet was that this moment was being recorded by 3 different security cameras mounted on the Whole Foods building and by the dashcam in Officer Mitchell's patrol car. Every word would be captured. Every action documented. Every constitutional violation preserved in digital clarity. And within 72 hours, those recordings would be in the hands of FBI Special Agent Karen Donaldson, who would watch them with growing disbelief before opening what would become the most significant civil rights investigation in Atlanta Police Department history. Officer Mitchell, a 34-year-old white man with pale skin and close-cropped brown hair, had been with the Atlanta Police Department for 9 years. He approached Judge Matthews's Mercedes at 4:52 p.m., his hand resting on his service weapon. His first words weren't a greeting or an explanation. They were a command, sharp and aggressive. "Step away from the vehicle." Judge Matthews turned, startled, a bag of groceries still in her hands. Her first instinct, honed by 7 years on the federal bench and decades of living as a black woman in America, was to stay calm and ask questions. She set the bag down carefully in the trunk. "Officer, is there a problem?" Mitchell's eyes scanned her car with undisguised suspicion, taking in the pristine silver paint, the luxury interior visible through the windows, the judicial robes hanging in the back seat. His jaw tightened. "This vehicle was reported stolen. I need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance." Judge Matthews felt the familiar tension that comes when you know something is terribly wrong. She'd heard this story before in her courtroom, from witnesses who'd described being stopped, questioned, treated as criminals for existing in the wrong neighborhood. She'd never imagined it would happen to her, not in broad daylight, not in a Whole Foods parking lot. "Officer, I can assure you this is my car. I purchased it new last year. I have all the documentation." She reached slowly into her handbag, moving deliberately, keeping her hands visible, remembering the training her father had given her years ago about interacting with police. Always be polite. Always keep your hands visible. She pulled out her wallet and began removing her driver's license. But Mitchell wasn't interested in de-escalation. He stepped closer, his body language aggressive, invading her personal space in a way designed to intimidate. His voice rose. "I didn't tell you to reach into anything. I told you to step away from the vehicle." Judge Matthews froze, her license in one hand, her other hand still in her purse. This was escalating in a way that made no sense. She was following his instructions, providing documentation, cooperating fully. Why was he treating her like a dangerous suspect? "Officer, I'm simply getting my identification, which you requested. People like you always have some excuse. You think I don't know what's going on here?" The words hung in the air, loaded with implications that didn't need to be stated explicitly. "People like you." Judge Matthews felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced it down. Anger would only give him an excuse to escalate further. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, officer. I'm complying with your request for documentation. Here is my driver's license. My registration is in the glove compartment." She held out her license, but Mitchell didn't take it. He looked at the photo, looked at her face, then looked at the Mercedes again, his expression making clear exactly what he thought. "Someone like you driving a $70,000 car. Right. And I'm supposed to believe you bought this legally. Someone like you." There it was again, barely coded language that meant exactly what they both knew it meant. Judge Matthews had sentenced men to prison for less blatant civil rights violations. She'd written opinions excoriating officers who engaged in racial profiling. And now she was experiencing it firsthand, standing in a parking lot while a white officer with a badge and a gun questioned whether she had the right to own the car she'd purchased with money she'd earned through 2 decades of exemplary legal work. She made a decision. She would not let this man rob her of her dignity or her rights. She would assert exactly who she was. "Officer, I am Judge Diane Matthews of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. This is my vehicle. I have committed no crime. You are engaging in racial profiling and violating my Fourth Amendment rights." For a brief moment, Mitchell's expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by defensive aggression. He'd gone too far to back down now. Admitting he was wrong would mean admitting he'd just racially profiled a federal judge in broad daylight with cameras watching. So instead of apologizing, instead of checking her credentials, instead of making the phone call that would have confirmed she was telling the truth, he doubled down. "Sure you are. And I'm the police chief. Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." "I will not. I have identified myself. I have offered documentation. I have committed no crime that would justify detention. You have no probable cause and no reasonable suspicion." Mitchell's hand moved to his handcuffs. His voice turned cold. "You're being detained for investigation of vehicle theft and for obstruction. If you don't comply, you'll be arrested for resisting." Judge Matthews felt the surreal horror of the moment. This was actually happening. A police officer was about to arrest a federal judge in a parking lot because he couldn't accept that a black woman might legitimately own a Mercedes. She had two choices: comply and sort it out later, or continue asserting her rights and risk harm. She thought of Sandra Bland, arrested after a routine traffic stop, found dead in her cell 3 days later. She thought of Breonna Taylor, shot in her own home. She thought of every case that had come before her where citizens had been brutalized for asserting rights that were supposed to be guaranteed by the Constitution. But she also thought of her position, her training, her responsibility as someone who'd spent her career fighting for justice. If she didn't stand up now, when would she? "Officer, I am clearly stating for the record that I do not consent to this detention. I do not consent to any search of my person or my vehicle. You are violating my constitutional rights. I want your badge number and the name of your supervisor." But what Officer Mitchell didn't know was that his 9-year career was about to end in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Within 72 hours, he would be placed on administrative leave. Within 2 weeks, federal agents would be interviewing him about a pattern of misconduct that spanned nearly a decade. And within 6 months, he would be standing in a federal courtroom, facing Judge Harold Chen, hearing the words that would destroy his life: "Mr. Mitchell, the jury has found you guilty on all counts. I am sentencing you to 15 years in federal prison." Mitchell grabbed Judge Matthews by the arm, spinning her around and forcing her against her Mercedes. Shoppers stopped to watch, phones coming out, witnesses documenting what was unfolding. Mitchell pulled her arms behind her back and snapped handcuffs around her wrists. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest." Judge Matthews's voice remained steady, though her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "I am a federal judge. I have not resisted. I have not obstructed. I have asserted my constitutional rights. Every word you've said is being recorded by multiple cameras. You are making the biggest mistake of your career." Mitchell pulled her toward his patrol car while a crowd formed. A woman in yoga clothes was filming. An elderly man in a business suit was already on his phone calling for help. "Yes, I'm witnessing what appears to be a wrongful arrest of a black woman at the Whole Foods on Peachtree. There's an Atlanta police officer. She says she's a judge. This doesn't look right." Judge Matthews used her lawyer's voice, clear and projecting, making sure every witness could hear. "My name is Judge Diane Matthews. I am a federal judge for the Northern District of Georgia. I was loading groceries into my car. This officer has detained me without probable cause, accused me of driving a stolen vehicle that I legally own, and is now arresting me for asserting my constitutional rights. I need witnesses to document what is happening." 3 more phones came out. A man in a Tesla called 911. A woman approached Mitchell. "Officer, I think you need to check her identification. She's been shopping here for years. I've seen her. This is her car. Mitchell ignored her, opening the back door of his patrol car. Judge Matthews didn't resist physically, turning to face the growing crowd of witnesses. "Officer Mitchell is violating my civil rights. I am being unlawfully detained and arrested. Please make sure this is documented." Mitchell shoved her into the back seat, her head hitting the door frame. He slammed the door and turned to the crowd. "This woman is being arrested for legitimate reasons. Everyone needs to disperse." But the crowd wasn't dispersing. They were recording. They were calling for supervisors. They were providing contact information to each other as witnesses. And in the back of the patrol car, Judge Matthews was mentally documenting every detail. The FBI investigation would soon reveal that this wasn't an isolated incident of one officer having a bad day. Over the next 8 weeks, Special Agent Donaldson and a team of 6 federal investigators would interview 94 witnesses and uncover a pattern that shocked even seasoned civil rights prosecutors. Officer Mitchell had accumulated 52 complaints over his 9-year career. 37 involved allegations of racial profiling. 14 claimed excessive force. 6 specifically mentioned stops in affluent neighborhoods where black drivers were questioned about whether they'd stolen their vehicles. Every single complaint had been dismissed with minimal investigation, often within 48 hours, with the same phrase appearing again and again in the files: insufficient evidence to sustain allegation. Mitchell sat in the driver's seat of his patrol car, filling out an arrest report while Judge Matthews sat handcuffed in the back. She watched him through the metal grate separating them, noting the way his hand shook slightly as he wrote. He was beginning to realize, perhaps, that something was wrong. That this hadn't gone the way he'd expected. That the woman in his back seat wasn't intimidated or confused or willing to accept this treatment quietly. After 12 minutes, a supervisor arrived. Sergeant David Weber, a 43-year-old white man with a weathered face and gray temples, pulled up in an unmarked vehicle. Mitchell got out to meet him, and Judge Matthews watched through the window as they spoke in low voices. Mitchell gestured toward the Mercedes. Weber glanced at the crowd of witnesses, his expression troubled. He walked over to Mitchell's patrol car and opened the back door. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Weber. Can you explain what happened here?" Judge Matthews looked at him with the same level gaze she used from the bench when lawyers tried to obfuscate or deceive. "My name is Judge Diane Elizabeth Matthews. I am a federal judge for the United States District Court, Northern District of Georgia. I was loading groceries into my legally owned vehicle when Officer Mitchell approached and accused me of driving a stolen car. When I provided identification and documentation, he escalated the situation, used racially charged language, violated my Fourth Amendment rights, and arrested me for asserting my constitutional rights. I want these handcuffs removed immediately, and I want a formal complaint filed against Officer Mitchell." Weber's face went pale. He pulled out his phone, typed rapidly, and Judge Matthews saw his eyes widen as he read whatever appeared on his screen. He was looking at her federal court biography, seeing her official photo in judicial robes, reading her credentials, understanding exactly how catastrophically Mitchell had screwed up. "Judge Matthews, I apologize. There's been a terrible mistake." "Yes, there has. And it's going to cost this department dearly." Weber called for another unit, then personally removed the handcuffs from Judge Matthews's wrists. She stepped out of the patrol car, rubbing her wrists where the metal had left red marks, and faced the crowd of witnesses who'd stayed to see the resolution. "Thank you all for documenting this. I'll need your contact information for the federal lawsuit that will be filed." 5 people immediately stepped forward with business cards and phone numbers. The woman in yoga clothes had already uploaded her video to Twitter with the hashtag Judge Matthews arrest. It had 847 retweets. At that exact moment, 2,100 people were watching the live footage that had been streaming to Facebook from one witness's phone. Within 90 minutes, that number would explode to 43,000. By 9 o'clock that evening, the video would be shared by civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens, and Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock. CNN would run it as breaking news at 10 p.m. The New York Times would publish a story by midnight. And by Friday morning, the video would have been viewed over 12 million times. Once the internet had it, Officer Mitchell's career wasn't just over, it was being dissected in real time by millions of people who couldn't believe what they were watching. Judge Matthews drove home that evening in a daze, the salmon still in her trunk, the dinner party forgotten. She called Marcus from the car, her voice finally breaking as she described what had happened. He met her in the driveway, holding her while she cried angry tears, then helped her document the bruises on her wrists and arm, photographing every injury with careful attention to detail. By the time their guests arrived at 8:30, the story was national news. Judge Matthews sat in her living room with 7 friends, lawyers, and doctors who'd known her for 20 years, and made a decision. She wasn't going to stay quiet. She wasn't going to accept a private apology and a promise to retrain officers. She was going to use every bit of legal knowledge, every connection, every ounce of credibility she'd earned over a lifetime of public service to ensure that this resulted in real accountability and meaningful change. Friday morning, Judge Matthews held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. She wore a navy suit, her judicial bearing on full display, and spoke for 7 minutes without notes. Her statement was measured, precise, and devastating. Yesterday, I was racially profiled, unlawfully detained, and falsely arrested by an Atlanta police officer while loading groceries into my car in broad daylight. This happened because Officer Brandon Mitchell looked at a black woman driving a Mercedes and concluded, with no evidence whatsoever, that I must have stolen it. When I identified myself as a federal judge and provided documentation, he dismissed my credentials and escalated his unlawful conduct. What happened to me is not unique. It happens to Black Americans every single day. The only difference is that I have the knowledge, resources, and platform to fight back. I am filing a federal civil rights lawsuit, and I am calling for a Department of Justice investigation into the Atlanta Police Department's pattern and practice of racial profiling. The video of her statement went viral faster than the arrest footage. By Saturday morning, it had 18 million views. Protests erupted outside Atlanta Police Department headquarters, peaceful demonstrations demanding accountability. The hashtag Justice for Judge Matthews trended #1 nationwide for 3 consecutive days. And what nobody at that press conference knew yet was that Judge Matthews's case would ultimately cost the city $1.8 million in settlement money, but the financial price would be dwarfed by the institutional consequences. The federal investigation would uncover emails showing systematic dismissal of racial profiling complaints. Text messages between officers would reveal racist jokes and language. Training records would prove that bias awareness was given minimal attention. And before it was over, 14 officers would be fired, 6 would face criminal charges, and the entire department would be placed under federal oversight that continues to this day. The FBI investigation moved with unusual speed, driven by the high-profile nature of the case and the mountain of video evidence. Special Agent Karen Donaldson, a 19-year veteran with expertise in civil rights violations, led a team that worked 16-hour days. They obtained Mitchell's complete personnel file, every complaint, every incident report, every evaluation for his entire 9-year career. What they found was damning. Mitchell had been involved in 73 traffic stops where the driver was black, compared to just 18 where the driver was white or Hispanic, despite working in a district with relatively balanced demographics. In 28 of those stops, He'd questioned whether the driver legitimately owned their vehicle. 14 resulted in searches that found no contraband. 4 resulted in arrests that were later dismissed for lack of evidence. The pattern was so stark that a statistical analysis commissioned by federal prosecutors determined there was less than a 1% chance it was due to random variation. Mitchell was engaging in systematic racial profiling, and he'd been doing it for years. But the most damning evidence came from Mitchell's own words, captured in text messages with other officers. In a group chat obtained through subpoena, investigators found messages from October 2022 where Mitchell had written, "Stopped a brother in a BMW today. Swore up and down it was his. Had to let him go but I know he was lying." Another from March 2023, "These people move into Buckhead and think they belong. Someone needs to remind them." And a particularly vicious exchange from May 2023, just 6 weeks before the Judge Matthews incident, saw a sister in a Range Rover at Lenox. "Definitely stolen. Ran the plates and it came back clean. System must be broken." The FBI shared its findings with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Within 3 weeks, federal prosecutors convened a grand jury. On July 28, 2023, exactly 36 days after the arrest, FBI agents appeared at Mitchell's home at 6 in the morning. His wife answered the door in her bathrobe, confused, then horrified as agents placed her husband in handcuffs in front of their 2 children, ages 8 and 11. Mitchell was charged with deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony carrying up to 10 years in prison, and making false statements to federal investigators, which carried an additional 5 years. But the criminal case was just one part of Judge Matthews's fight for accountability. 2 weeks after the arrest, her attorney, Rebecca Martinez of Martinez & Chen, one of Atlanta's most respected civil rights firms, filed a comprehensive federal lawsuit under Section 1983. The complaint named Officer Mitchell, Sergeant Weber for failing to properly supervise, Lieutenant James Patterson for dismissing previous complaints against Mitchell without investigation, and the City of Atlanta for maintaining policies that enabled racial profiling. The complaint was 47 pages long and meticulously detailed. It included the complete video footage from 3 security cameras and Mitchell's dashcam. It attached sworn declarations from 17 witnesses. It included expert analysis from Dr. Samuel Richardson, a criminologist at Georgia State University, who testified that Mitchell's stop-and-search pattern showed clear evidence of racial bias. It documented Judge Matthews's injuries, her emotional distress, and the violation of her constitutional rights. And it demanded compensatory damages, punitive damages, and comprehensive reforms to prevent future incidents. The case landed like a bomb in the offices of the Atlanta City Attorney. Insurance carriers immediately distanced themselves, noting that intentional civil rights violations weren't covered under the city's liability policy. The city faced the prospect of paying any judgment or settlement entirely from municipal funds, which would mean taking money from schools, infrastructure, and public services. Emergency meetings were held. Outside counsel was retained. And within 72 hours, settlement discussions began. But Judge Matthews wasn't interested in a quick private settlement that would make the case disappear. She wanted public accountability, documented reforms, and consequences for everyone who'd enabled Mitchell's misconduct. Her attorney made the terms clear: any settlement would require public admission of wrongdoing, termination of Mitchell and his supervisors, implementation of specific reforms with federal oversight, and a settlement amount large enough to send a message. Mitchell thought he could bully a black woman in a parking lot and face no consequences, just like he had in 52 previous complaints that were dismissed without investigation, just like he'd done for 9 years while supervisors looked the other way. He thought his badge would protect him, thought no one would believe her word against his, thought she would be too intimidated or too tired to fight back. He was catastrophically wrong. The video evidence was irrefutable. The federal charges were inevitable. And the 15-year prison sentence he would ultimately receive would send shockwaves through police departments across the country. Racial profiling isn't just wrong, it's a federal crime, and the price is your freedom. Additional victims began coming forward within days of Judge Matthews's press conference. Attorney Martinez set up a hotline, and within 2 weeks, 43 people had called with similar stories of stops by Mitchell or other Atlanta officers. A 56-year-old black physician reported being stopped in 2021 while driving his Lexus in Buckhead, questioned about whether he'd stolen it, and searched despite having no contraband. A 39-year-old black software engineer described being pulled over in 2022 in his Tesla, accused of fitting a suspicious profile, and held for 45 minutes while Mitchell searched his vehicle and found nothing. A 62-year-old black woman who owned a chain of restaurants reported being stopped in her Mercedes SUV in 2020, told she didn't look like someone who would drive such a vehicle, and questioned so aggressively that she'd filed a complaint that was dismissed within 24 hours. The FBI investigation expanded to include these cases. Pattern and practice investigations are complex and resource-intensive, but the Matthews case provided undeniable evidence that justified the effort. Federal investigators obtained stop data for the entire Atlanta Police Department, analyzed it by district and officer, and found disturbing trends. In the Buckhead district where Mitchell worked, black drivers were 4.3 times more likely to be stopped than white drivers, even though they comprised only 31% of the neighborhood's population. Search rates for black drivers were 3.8 times higher. Yet contraband was found in black drivers' vehicles at lower rates than in white drivers' vehicles, suggesting the searches were based on bias rather than legitimate suspicion. The data confirmed what community members had been saying for years: racial profiling wasn't a few bad apples, it was department-wide practice, enabled by inadequate training, insufficient oversight, and a culture that prioritized enforcement over constitutional rights. When confronted with this evidence, Atlanta's political leaders had no choice but to accept federal intervention. Mitchell's criminal trial began on March 4, 2024, in the same federal courthouse where Judge Matthews presided over her own cases. She wasn't there, of course, recused from any involvement, but the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Mitchell was being tried in the building where his victim worked, before a jury drawn from the community he'd sworn to serve. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen, presented a devastating case over 7 days. Chen played the complete footage of the arrest, unedited, letting the jury see exactly what Mitchell had done. He called 12 witnesses who testified about previous encounters with Mitchell that followed the same pattern: black drivers, luxury vehicles, accusations of theft, aggressive searches, no contraband found. He presented the text messages, reading them aloud in a courtroom that fell completely silent as jurors heard Mitchell's own words revealing his bias. He called Dr. Richardson, the criminologist, who explained the statistical impossibility of Mitchell's stop pattern being anything other than intentional discrimination. Judge Matthews herself testified for 3 hours, describing the arrest in clinical detail, explaining how each action violated her constitutional rights, recounting the racial undertones in Mitchell's language. She maintained her composure throughout, answering questions with precision, but when Chen asked how the incident had affected her, her voice finally broke. "I've spent my entire adult life serving the law. I've sent people to prison for civil rights violations. I've ruled on cases involving police misconduct. I thought I understood the system. But sitting in the back of that patrol car, handcuffed, knowing I'd done nothing wrong, feeling completely powerless despite all my education and credentials and position, I understood for the first time what so many people experience every day. And it terrified me. Because if this can happen to a federal judge, what hope do ordinary citizens have?" The defense tried to argue that Mitchell had acted in good faith based on a mistaken stolen vehicle report, but the prosecution demolished that claim by showing that Mitchell had never actually received such a report. He'd made it up, inventing justification after the fact. When phone records showed he'd never called dispatch to verify the vehicle's status, the defense strategy collapsed. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman, a 54-year-old white teacher from Marietta, read the verdict in a clear voice: "We find the defendant, Brandon Mitchell, guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law. We find the defendant guilty of making false statements to federal investigators." Mitchell sat motionless as the verdict was read, his face drained of color. His wife sobbed in the gallery. Judge Harold Chen, presiding over the case, scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. On April 22, 2024, Mitchell returned to court for sentencing. Judge Chen, known for thoughtful and proportionate sentences, spoke for 12 minutes before imposing punishment. He noted the seriousness of civil rights violations committed by law enforcement officers who abused their power. He emphasized the pattern of misconduct that had been enabled by inadequate oversight. And he made clear that Mitchell's actions had undermined public trust in law enforcement at a time when that trust was already dangerously low. "Mr. Mitchell, you violated your oath. You violated the Constitution. And you violated the dignity of a respected jurist and countless other citizens who had the misfortune to encounter you while driving in their own city. This court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will have no contact with law enforcement agencies upon your release. You will forfeit your pension. And you will spend the next decade and a half contemplating the consequences of allowing bias and arrogance to guide your actions." The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly silenced by court security, but the message was clear. The community had waited for this moment, and justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. The civil case settled 1 week later. Judge Martinez and city attorneys reached an agreement that gave Judge Matthews nearly everything she demanded. The city would pay $1.8 million, one of the largest settlements in Atlanta history for a wrongful arrest case. Mitchell was fired, along with Sergeant Weber and Lieutenant Patterson, all forfeiting their pensions. The settlement required implementation of specific reforms: mandatory bias training conducted quarterly by independent experts, body cameras for all officers with strict policies against deactivation, a civilian oversight board with subpoena power and independent authority to investigate complaints, and public reporting of stop data disaggregated by race with annual audits. Most significantly, the settlement required a federal consent decree placing the entire Atlanta Police Department under Department of Justice monitoring for a minimum of 5 years. Federal monitors would review policies, observe training, audit investigations of complaints, and ensure compliance with constitutional standards. The city's police budget would be restructured, with funding shifted from enforcement to community programs, mental health resources, and de-escalation training. At the settlement press conference, Judge Matthews stood beside her attorney and spoke about what the moment meant. "This settlement represents accountability not just for one officer's misconduct, but for a system that enabled that misconduct for years. Money alone cannot restore what was taken from me and from the 43 other victims who came forward. But systemic reform, real oversight, and cultural change can prevent this from happening to the next person. That's what this fight was always about." Mitchell is currently serving year 2 of his 15-year sentence at a federal correctional facility in Jessup, Georgia. He's housed in protective custody because former police officers face significant danger from other inmates. His wife divorced him 7 months into his sentence. His children, now teenagers, have refused all contact since his conviction. He lost his home to foreclosure, his pension is gone, and his legal fees exceeded $180,000, paid through the sale of every asset he owned. When he's released in 2037 at age 49, he will be a convicted felon, prohibited from ever working in law enforcement, with a criminal record that will make employment nearly impossible. His name is permanently linked to one of the most notorious cases of racial profiling in modern Georgia history. Judge Matthews returned to the federal bench with renewed purpose. Her experience transformed her perspective on every case involving police conduct, use of force, or civil rights violations. She approaches each case with deep understanding of how power can be abused and how marginalized communities experience law enforcement. Her courtroom has become known as a place where constitutional rights are defended vigorously and where government misconduct is scrutinized with exceptional care. But her impact extends far beyond her courtroom. She testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee about racial profiling and police reform, her testimony cited in proposed legislation. She established the Matthews Justice Foundation, which provides legal assistance to victims of police misconduct who lack resources to fight back. She speaks regularly at police academies, law schools, and community forums, sharing her story and challenging both officers and citizens to demand better. Her willingness to use her platform has inspired 127 additional victims to come forward with their own experiences, creating a wave of accountability that continues to reshape law enforcement practices across Georgia and beyond. The Atlanta Police Department has undergone the most comprehensive transformation in its 155-year history. Federal oversight remains in effect, with quarterly audits and public reporting requirements that ensure transparency. Complaints of racial profiling dropped 52% in the first year of the consent decree. Use of force incidents declined by 41%. Community trust surveys, administered by independent researchers, showed a 28-point improvement in Black residents' confidence in fair treatment. The department hired a new chief committed to constitutional policing, established a professional standards division with real investigative authority, and terminated 14 officers who'd accumulated patterns of complaints similar to Mitchell's. The reforms have become a model studied by police departments nationwide. Delegations from Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Los Angeles have visited Atlanta to observe the changes and consider implementing similar programs. The Matthews case is now required study material in 37 police academies across the country, used to train officers about the real consequences of racial profiling. Law schools teach the case in constitutional law and civil rights courses, analyzing the intersection of race, power, and justice. Judge Matthews's arrest, which lasted 37 minutes on a Thursday afternoon in June, has educated thousands of future officers and lawyers about what happens when badges become weapons and how accountability can emerge from injustice. Sometimes justice is slow. Sometimes it feels impossible. Sometimes the system seems designed to protect wrongdoers rather than hold them accountable. But when brave people refuse to stay silent, when evidence is documented and preserved, when communities demand change and federal authorities intervene, accountability can be absolutely devastating to those who thought they were untouchable. Judge Diane Matthews proved that racial profiling has a price, and that price is measured in careers destroyed, freedom lost, reputations ruined, and legacies permanently tarnished. She proved that badges don't grant immunity from the Constitution they're sworn to uphold. And she proved that even when the power imbalance seems insurmountable, justice can prevail if we fight for it with everything we have. If this story moved you, share it. Because accountability starts with awareness, and change begins when silence ends.